Tom, who didn't know that he was interested. Several years ago, I became acquainted with Tom Singleton and invited him to begin playing in our 7 a.m. Saturday basketball game at our ward building. Tom began coming, and he seemed to enjoy the camaraderie that we enjoyed there. I decided Tom was a good candidate for the missionary discussions, so I asked him if he would like to take them. Tom's response was, "If I say I'm not interested, will you still let me play ball?" I said, "Of course." And Tom responded in his typically unvarnished way, "Good, I'm not interested." Tom kept playing with us. He seemed to be enjoying the game with the guys in the ward so much that I decided a few months later to invite him again to come to our home and learn a bit about what made Mormons tick. "Did the rules change?" Tom asked. "What rules?" was my response. "You told me that I didn't have to become a Mormon in order to play ball." "No, you don't need to become a Mormon, Tom. We love having you come. I just thought that you'd like to know something that all of these guys share in common," I said. "Thanks, but I'm really not interested." At about that time, a new missionary was assigned to our ward. It had always been a hard place to find people to teach, and as a consequence, this young missionary had not taught anything beyond the first discussion in the 3 months he had been serving. So, after a basketball game a few weeks later, I pulled Tom Singleton aside. I said, "Tom, I know you have no interest in becoming a Mormon, but I wonder if you could help me. Just like I was a missionary for the church in Korea, young missionaries have been assigned to work here. They are supposed to learn how to teach a set of lessons to people who are interested in learning about our church. But the problem is that everyone in this area seems to be a hardened Catholic like you. Nobody seems interested. Without anybody to teach, they just haven't been able to learn these lessons, but they need to be ready just in case they run into somebody who is curious. Is there any way these guys could come to your house and just let them practice teaching these lessons to you? I want you to give them a hard time. Really make it as realistic a practice as you can." Tom accepted. I told the missionaries what the deal was, that Tom wasn't interested in our church, but that he had offered to help them practice their teaching. I told them to teach in as sincere and realistic a way as possible. I went to the first lesson just to be sure they followed the rules. At the end of the first lesson, the junior companion pulled out a copy of the Book of Mormon and offered it to Tom and his wife Anne, saying, "Would you read this book?" To our great surprise, they accepted it and said they would. They did, and they were baptized. When my invitation centered on how the church would interest them, Tom wasn't interested. But when I asked for help, Tom said, "Sure." He and his wife have become wonderful members of our ward. The eye of a fly, a welded beam of steel, and alcohol. When I served as priest quorum advisor, we reserved the third Tuesday of every month as a career night, an event where we met a member of the ward in his or her place of employment. Those individuals would then explain or show what their professions entailed. At that time, one of my company's premier scientists, Mark, seemed to have a grudge against Mormons, and he would find a way to ridicule the church in any conversation. On the Sunday before a scheduled career night, the ward member who had volunteered to introduce us to his profession said that he couldn't do it because he had to leave town unexpectedly on company business. So the next day I told Mark about our career nights and that our next host could not do it. "Mark, I'm sorry to ask this with so little notice," I said, "but is there any way that you could introduce materials science to our boys tomorrow night if we brought them here to your lab?" "I'd be happy to do that," was Mark's reply. "What time can you get them here? And when do you need to finish to get them home on time?" The next evening was perhaps the most engaging activity in the history of our youth program. Mark was an expert in the use of the electron microscope, and he had learned that when he covered the specimen he was working on with a thin film of gold, it maximized the clarity of the image. So Mark had killed a housefly and sputtered it with a film of gold. We spent 2 hours studying the eye of a housefly through an electron microscope. Every priest left Mark's lab with the resolve to become a scientist. Another man I met ran a welding shop. I asked him to teach my priests how to weld. When we arrived, I found that he had cut steel rods to standard lengths, and he gave a set of these rods to each boy. He had purposefully left himself one kit short so that he could teach the boys how to cut rods of steel with an acetylene torch. He then helped each boy weld his rods together into a bar stool to take home. They were really cute stools, and these 17-year-olds were just beaming with pride as we left. When I tried to pay my friend for the cost of the steel, he wouldn't take the money, and instead thanked me for being so interested in his work. Another time, I asked a policeman to tell the boys what his job was like. Among other things, he took them through the process for arresting drivers suspected of being intoxicated. He brought a bottle of whiskey and took a swallow, unusual in our church, so that the boys could smell his breath and see how quickly it could be measured. Without exception, these activities that my non-member friends managed were of especially high quality. They had never been asked to do this sort of thing before, and they seemed to feel complimented that the boys were interested in their professions. None of these friends has yet joined our church, but each of them gained an understanding of the essence of our religion much more deeply than if they had just read something. Please continue listening on CD number 2.